Hey, everybody, I'm Chris Metzler here, one of the programmers with IndieFest. If you've never been to the festival before, we've been bringing some of the most interesting, cool, and irreverent films from around the world in independent film for the last 28 years to San Francisco. And so when we ran across this film and submissions, we were really excited to see if we could bring it here. And Serendipity intervened, and you just saw the really terrific documentary, Join the Club. And we're lucky enough to have one of the directors, Kip, here. Welcome, Kip.
Thank you.
Um, so maybe a good story. I think, documentaries are kind of all the rage nowadays, but people often wonder, like, how do people come up with ideas, for documentaries and then also kind of pull the trigger to take that leap of faith to kind of try to make it. So, um, how did you kind of discover the story and decide that, you wanted to give it a try and craft this really wonderful film you made?
Yeah, I've made several other big documentaries, and this one is the one I've always wanted to make before my other previous ones. And the reason why is because I was actually there. If you just saw the film, I was on the front lines. I opened with a couple of guy who's a lot older than me. I was very young at the time. The very first legal cannabis club after Proposition 215 passed in the entire country. And it was right in the Tenderloin, and we had to ask Dennis Peron for his permission. He's and so I lived that there, and I just was like, oh, an aspiring filmmaker, someone's got to do a documentary, and ideally, still to this day, I want to do a whole um, narrative. You know, Dennis Peron is acted by a certain actor, the whole thing, because this story is just phenomenal. Anyway, long story short, I could not believe after 10, 15 years, no one had done it yet. And so in the back burner, I'm like, oh, and I knew he was getting older, and we've interviewed him just months before he died. So I contacted Chris, my co-director, said, Chris, jump on this. We got to do this now while he's alive. And thank goodness Chris really took it by the horns. And we interviewed him and told the whole story, as you saw. So anyway, this is a very passionate personal project for me because I've been on the front lines as a cannabis medical activist for a long time.
So, it raises always an interesting question, like, as a filmmaker, when you have kind of a personal connection or kind of like intimately familiar with it, like, what sort of challenges does it present to kind of like, how do you kind of tell the story with it, like inside knowledge, but also kind of like tell a story that kind of resonates for folks that aren't really familiar with it? Like, so how do you kind of navigate that as you're kind of figuring out how to tell the story?
Yeah, navigating this one was particularly challenging at the beginning because, as you saw, we wanted to play both sides, you know, the Joe Bannons and even, Dan Lundgren. At the time, Dan Lundgren was Darth Vader. I mean, you couldn't get someone more evil. And so we wanted to show their perspective on that to get two sides. So it's not just all, these guys are horrible. And I feel we did a good job, and especially the surprising meetings, particularly Dan Lundgren, who was the governor of California or the attorney general. When we actually met him, I finally, got to see his side, like really empathize with him. And through his lens, I kind of saw that, and we wanted to show a little bit of that. So that was a challenge of showing like I was so, for Dennis and for that whole movement, but then showing a colorful side that Joe Bannon, he was doing his best. He's not all evil, but to how to show him as a human being in relating to this times he was in. And I have a lot of compassion and empathy for what he went through. He kind of got, you know, he didn't really know, I feel, know what he was getting himself into after it was all said and done, like, oh, what just happened? And I wanted to have that come off a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think the film does a great job of that kind of nuance and layer, and I mean it's always interesting, like one thing living through history, but then when you go back and look at history, about how um how much gradation there is, in some ways, especially when you're dealing with such an important subject. You know, as you were kind of going out and like telling the story, did you, you know, wind up finding that people were kind of familiar with aspects of the story, or was this in some ways, is this kind of a hidden history for maybe younger people and other things? Like, what have you kind of ran into?
Yeah, it's definitely a hidden history big time. Like, being in the movement, not so much anymore, but going to cannabis clubs right now, if you ask the owner of the cannabis clubs, might be driving, a Ferrari or whatever. I mean, maybe a few years ago, it's not so much like that. They would have no idea where this started. And so I feel for me too, that it's very important to tell the important history of where this movement started by particularly one man. And so, but the people that were part of it, they were like, oh, finally the story. They were so excited to tell share their story, that were on the front lines every day, risking 10, 20 life in jail, to telling the story that they went through, and everyone just uplifting Dennis's legacy. And the one thing I want to share is that no film could do it justice of how important Dennis Peron was, not only to the cannabis movement, but the LGBTQ movement, on having a voice in something so big, and those interlacing into one big thing. And that was something special for me going through it, living it back then, but doing the film just even more so. Like, God, Dennis Peron, like, what a badass. Wow. It just ceases to amaze me. And we just touched on it in the film, but the levels of dangerous of what he was doing against the federal government, that it's hard to even put in words or in a film. That guy was so beyond a badass. I try to compare
Mm.
him to something else other than like a Martin Luther King. Very different, but as far as just badassness of being an activist for a few different angles on what was happening at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I think the thing that, I mean, even myself who like lived through those times is that, you know, how dangerous and how much risk there was at play. It's like some of that kind of has um, been overshadowed in more recent years. And I guess this, you know, leads to another question. It's like, so on the programmer side of things at film festivals, like we see a lot of cannabis documentaries kind of come through submissions and, cannabis club stuff. And, it's, it's, it was kind of a nice breath of fresh air to kind of run across the story, not just based on the important history, but also the kind of way that you approach telling the story, in the sense that like it wasn't agitprop. It's like, I mean, this is just like a story with kind of emotion and heart, and of course larger resonance, but just like a really great story. So like, what was you know what was your kind of aesthetic approach when you decided to tell the story? Was there kind of like a look and feel that you were wanting to bring as a filmmaker to it, and how did you kind of come about to that?
Yeah, well, initially started as when it's so big and there's so many massive characters in there. You have Dennis Peron, but then you have Brownie Mary, then you have Tony Serra, the most interesting, hands down, lawyer of our country in the last 30 years. And then you have Joe Bannon. So every one of these, you could do a full tangent story or of a film. So this initially was a four-part series, each of them being an hour long. And that was hard to edit down. So you can
Right.
only imagine, once that was, we wanted to make it into a movie, to bring it down to an hour and a half and to have everyone somewhat tell their story as big as we can. So aesthetically, we wanted to have that feel of the 90s, which we're just so, thanks to Chris, my co-director or director who led it, to find all these 90s VHS footage that have that feel, and then the animations that go along with it and the music. I feel we did a great job of that. Just to really, it's just like a time warp. It puts you back in the 90s, and it really makes you feel that you're there. Again, thanks to so much of the footage that we have back then. And then other than that is just the challenge of aesthetically and, trying to technically figure out how to put this 4 to 10 hour story into 90 minutes.
And when you first kind of reached out to Dennis about like, hey, look, we want to make this, film, like what was his take on that? Was he ready to tell his story at that point in time, or was like, hey, look, I've told my story before, or, like what was his kind of reaction?
He was very grateful. And I feel as for him, we didn't talk about too much, but I feel for him it was way past due. And the particular stage that he was at, we didn't know he was gonna, I don't think he knew he was gonna die in months from then. But I don't know if it was true or not. And then this close circle around him, we're so grateful because we weren't sure either. And then the fact that we finished the interviews and we were really on the way of finishing it, he passed. And we feel good that I feel he passed in peace, knowing his story at least was done, because his legacy, again, it has to be
Mm,
told. And so it was really nice to feel that, I felt that he could go. Like he did his interviews. I'm sure there's a lot more to
yeah.
it, but it definitely felt good that I just wanted to honor him because, again, I've been in so I wanted to honor him some way for so long. And so it was the least that we could do.
Very cool. Well, one of the things I always kind of try to remind our audiences is that, we're lucky enough that filmmakers like you share their films with us, especially like early on in their life cycle. And so like our job is like for the films that we get a kick out of to go out there and kind of be the grassroots street team to kind of help spread the word about this like great film that you just saw at this film festival. So what are ways that people can continue to follow your kind of creative path, but also like where can they kind of point people to kind of like talk about your movie and kind of find out more?
Yeah, we're gonna put, we still have, maybe by the time it's out, we're gonna have its own Instagram or Facebook. We don't right now. My name's Kip Anderson, SEN at the end. You can follow me for updates for the film. That's probably the best right now. AUMfilms.org is what produced it and shows the other films that we did. And so just really, I guess at this point, Chris is, I am Chris O'Connell. He's an incredible artist as well to follow. And we're going to be doing updates on our personal page. So following us and just sharing, whether sharing the film, just sharing the story of Dennis and telling people, honoring who he was and telling the story as much as you can. But we have plans for it. So stay tuned.
Awesome. Well, cool, Kip. Thanks again for sharing this film with us at SF Indie Fest, and everybody continue to kind of talk and spread the word about this really wonderful film. Join the club.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate everybody.